Like all other sentient creatures on this planet, I love the Nintendo Switch. And while there might be just one or two truly unfortunate missteps, overall the library is utterly killer. And despite this console's underpowered hardware, there's a lot of really great experiences that you can have on this machine. I want to share with you one of those experiences I've had. Diablo 3 Eternal Collection for Nintendo Switch. Now, if you don't already own a copy of this game, you probably shouldn't buy it. Activision Blizzard's executive management is awful. Their CEO in particular is a personification of Hitler's post-mortem bowel movement. Really, really bad. And that's a shame, because Diablo 3 on the Nintendo Switch is the best Diablo-like experience you can get right now, in my opinion. You wouldn't think that a genre of game designed entirely around a mouse and keyboard would translate so well to a console's controller, but I have spent hundreds of hours enraptured in this game with a pair of Joy-Cons. It feels great. The port here utterly nails it. This has allowed me to get far deeper into the post-game of Diablo 3 than I would have ever been able to if just playing it on the PC, because it's easier to flop on the couch with your Switch. Now, the main thing I want to talk about in this video is the build. For people who want to get serious and deep into Diablo 3's post-game, there are build guides aplenty online, where people will tell you exactly what armor set to use, what accessories to use, what abilities to use, what passives to use, all of it. But simply following a connect the dots puzzle that somebody else laid out online didn't sound very fun to me. So instead, I went at it completely new, with no guidance whatsoever, and I just would read item descriptions, try out things in combat, and if it didn't work, I would experiment with something else. The result is the build I'm about to show you. It's probably really bad and not very well balanced. I'm sure there's some optimizing I could do that I was completely unaware of, but I tried my best, just going at it myself without anybody's guidance, and this is what I ended up with. The class I'm playing with here is Diablo 3's Wizard, which in the broader Blizzard pantheon is Li Ming. That's how she's named in Heroes of the Storm anyway. Now she's all about intelligence. Having more intelligence makes you stronger, bar none. So doing whatever you can to get more intelligence is by far the most important thing you can do, both for more damage and for more ruggedness. Now for the build, let's talk about abilities first. Primary attack is Electrocute, with a modification for fire damage. Electrocute is your basic poke, which doesn't really do much damage, but as a signature spell, it generates resource instead of spending it. So you'll often use this to recover when your arcane power is too low. The main damage dealing spell is Disintegrate, because every magician needs giant laser beams. This has a rune on it that modifies for double beam width. That sounds filthy when you say it like that. And fire damage. Next is the utility movement spell Teleport, which is exactly what it sounds like. Next two are Magic Weapon and Familiar, both modified just to grant extra damage. The Familiar shoots fire magic missiles at people as well. And then the large AoE spell Blizzard, ironically named, because it too has a modification for fire damage. You're seeing a pattern here. Now on to the passive abilities. Unstable Anomaly gives me a automatic revive effect with cooldown upon receiving fatal damage. Glass Cannon increases both your damage and the damage that you receive, and it's also basically what this entire build is, a glass cannon. Astral Presence increases your arcane power pool, and Prodigy makes you recover arcane power faster from basic attacks. This screen shows Kanai's powers, which is a game mechanic by which you can take the unique legendary quality off of a named legendary item and effectively just equip it as another passive ability. My weapon and armor Kanai slots are both dedicated to extra damage, and the jewelry slot gives me a buff that doubles the length of certain power-ups that I find while dungeoneering, which comes in super, super handy. Now to the equipment, which should explain some of my ability choices. My main weapon is this wand, the Ether Walker, whatever. The main point of this wand is that its legendary quality removes the cooldown for teleport, exchanging that for a resource cost instead. Effectively, this just lets you teleport all over the place like a coked up Kirby boss, and it entirely changes the flow of dungeoneering because you can just dart all over the place. Now, the primary armor set is the Firebird's Finery set. When you have enough pieces of this set, it gives you 3 incredibly important passive effects, which almost entirely define this build. The first effect is another revival effect, so I have 2 total. This revival effect is, upon receiving fatal damage, a meteor comes down and smashes you back to life, which is good for Phoenix theming, I suppose. The next effect is that every enemy you attack with a fire skill gets fire damage over time and will continue burning. But the most important effect is also the most complex one. Every enemy that you hit with 3 separate fire skills will gain the ignited status. This will cause the enemy to take even more damage over time, but more importantly, it also gives you a significant damage buff, and every enemy that you have under the ignited status will simply stack on top of that buff up to a maximum of 20, which gives you just enormous skyrocketed damage and allows you to hurt enemies that there's no way you could have touched before. A crucial technicality of this is every time you have a boss or elite enemy ignited, your damage bonus is always at the maximum, 20 stacks. This amulet makes me immune to all fire damage, which seems to be the most common elemental damage type used by enemies by far. It's also fitting to be immune to fire if you're themed on a phoenix. And it's socketed with a legendary gem that gives me a small but infinitely stacking damage buff against everything I attack. These bracers cause a pack of enemy elites to show up every time I accept a power-up from what's called shrines or pylons. That's incredibly important, and we'll see why a little bit later. This offhanded weapons supplement, called an orb or a focus, gives me a small damage buff, and also causes Blizzard to be cast for free every time I use my main offensive spell, Disintegrate. My 2 rings are just a 2-piece set, and they give me a damage bonus for intermittently cycling between a resource-generating attack, like Electrocute, and a resource-spending attack, like Disintegrate. These 2 rings are also set with a couple of legendary gems. One of them gives me a damage bonus after beating an elite enemy, and the bonus lasts for a little bit more than a minute. And the other ring gives me some health regen and shield effects for just a little bit of added toughness. And then finally for equipment we have this legendary belt that allows the primary attacks to generate a little bit more arcane power. You can also have one of 3 NPC followers following you around, either like a tough warrior, a rogue, or a magician. And it's fairly easy to find a trinket that makes them unkillable, so I have this dude around for just meat shielding. Just soaking up some punches for me. With all that said, I want to share what a typical piece of post-game dungeoneering has become like for me in Diablo 3. For me at least, it seems like the core of the post-game content revolves around rifts. Rifts are randomly generated dungeons with randomly placed enemies and power-ups and loot, and they're a lot of fun to go through, and they have infinitely escalating difficulty. It seems to be a pretty common goal among those who play Diablo 3's post-game to grind your way up to Greater Rift 100. Now, I'm not there yet. This Greater Rift that I just entered is Greater Rift 80, and 100 is a ways off for me. It is incredibly difficult to not die at least a couple of times when you're going through a Greater Rift of a high enough level. But death in rifts isn't actually the end of the game. It costs you some equipment durability, so if you die too many times, all your stuff just falls apart, you can't perform in battle, and you also lose about 35 seconds on the timer for every time you die. But if you kill enemies quickly enough, you can still make it. Greater Rifts are differentiated from normal rifts by the fact that Greater Rifts have a timer on them. and you need to kill enemies as quickly as you can to build up the timer to stay ahead of the clock. And every time you beat an elite pack of enemies, you get progress orbs. This is why the Nemesis bracers are so important, because every time I hit a shrine, actually called a pylon in a greater rift, it will spawn a group of elites and also give me the power of the pylon. When you're running through rifts with the Firebird set, it's incredibly important to keep elite enemies ignited as frequently as possible. As your rank gets up to higher and higher levels, these enemies become godly powerful with billions and trillions of hit points, and it becomes increasingly difficult for even your most powerful attacks to damage them. That is, unless you have an elite enemy ignited, giving you that 20 damage stack and actually making it possible to hurt these guys. I struggled a bit at the beginning here. This gets crazy, and fighting dozens of enemies in close quarters is quite difficult for a wizard. There, purple progress orbs for slaying an elite. That directly contributes to my timer and lets me build up progress against the clock. See, hitting that power pylon caused a group of elites to spawn, and keeping at least one of them ignited will keep my damage at the maximum. I also just get the power-up of the pylon, which is greatly increased damage and makes thinning out these monsters a little bit easier. Now I've caught up against my failures at the beginning, and I'm just a little bit ahead. You can't waste too much time on just a pack of purely normal enemies. They don't give you the major damage buff, and they just take forever to whittle down for not much credit against the clock. So if there's too few enemies to fight, you have to teleport away and find something else. That right there is my favorite power-up, the Shield Pylon. Diablo 3's Wizard is the quintessential essence of the squishy murderer hero. Lots of damage, but cannot take a punch. The Shield Pylon makes you completely invincible, and you are immune to control effects, so you can just stand there and beat the crap out of your enemies that would have taken a lot longer to whittle down otherwise. This is where the Flavor of Time Kanai power comes in so handy. Normally this power-up would just last 30 seconds, but now it lasts for a full minute, and it really lets me get a leg up on the timer.
Need more time. Still waiting. Not ready yet.
Some of these battles get so stupendously clustered that it starts to feel like a serious Sam game. And I'm pretty impressed that the Switch can handle this gracefully, what with all the actors and particle effects flying all over the place.
Still waiting.
The Conduit pylon is another really good power-up. It does damage that puts even my strongest weapons to shame, and it seems actually to be percentage damage, because it always does like a third or a quarter of an enemy's health bar, or at least so it seems. I could be wrong, but that's what it seems like. And it's pretty useful because you can just walk around and let the lightning passively kill everything for you. You can just focus on dodging and trying not to die, while it does all the murder on your behalf.
Need more time. Didn't see that coming, did you? Not ready yet.
Our opponents may be strong.
I need healing. I'm badly wounded. Still waiting. Help me.
One strategy I find myself using as frequently as opportunity permits is to get an elite enemy ignited and then turn around and start trying to mop up all the normal enemies that can now be killed very easily because my damage is at the 20 stack. It does require something of a balancing act, because if you get too far away from an elite enemy or any enemy that's ignited, then it loses the ignition effect. You have to stay within a certain proximity of it. So you might find yourself trying to lure the elite monsters back to where the normals are so you can mop up the normals pretty easily.
I need healing. Still waiting.
I've almost got the progress bar filled up way ahead of the timer, which means the boss is about to spawn.
Need more time. I must heal. I need healing.
The Rift Guardian has arrived.
There's the boss.
I must heal.
Just like everything else in the Rift, I have to kill the Rift Guardian before the timer runs out. Every time I take fatal damage while both of my revival effects are on cooldown, I die and lose some time on the timer, so I have to be careful, but I still screw up a whole bunch. Even though my performance here was very flawed, it was still Good enough. I get an explosion of random loot, and I can also talk to this ghosty woman here to upgrade legendary gems and make myself even more powerful. Now, while doing the post-rift cleanup, let me mention a metaphoric similarity that occurred to me. In this game, I am playing an Asian woman who has immaterial wings sprouted off her back, who uses powerful spells of fire, 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 and more fire. Everything's fire, everything always burns, fire, fire, fire. And she keeps getting back up no matter how many times you kill her. This sounds familiar. I know of a character like this. Where have I heard this?
I need to go back.
Oh. Good job, UD. I'm truly very clever for making that connection.